When I was 16 years old, I took my first trip to Italy with my parents, who were going back for the first time since they had left to come to America. Something I never, ever forgave them for. It was then that I discovered typography like this that made me want to become a graphic designer. It prompted me to collect beautiful specimens of Italian and French typography, which inspired me on a daily basis when I was art director of Pantheon Books. 2,000 book jackets later, I opened my own design firm. Well, look at that. I've just covered 20 years in less than 1 minute. I quickly learned two important lessons of having your own business. One, never depend on any one type of work or any one client. And two, and much more importantly, never sit and wait for the phone to ring with the perfect job. Why? Because there is no perfect job. The perfect job is the one that you make for yourself. As a designer, you need to create your own personal projects. Combine design with something that you're passionate about. It's the only way to grow and find your own design voice. Of course, you need to fit this in around the paying jobs. I chose to focus on the only three things that I'm interested in: food, type, and all things Italian. So I started with what was closest to my heart, Italian Art Deco, with this book, which expanded into a series of books on Art Deco graphic design that I did with my husband, Steve Heller. We've continued to do about 20 other books together, including what we've come to call the S series: scripts, shadow type, stencil, and slab serif. And I went on to do books that would give me an excuse to travel to Italy as often as possible, like this one, Italianissimo, which is something I can only describe as everything we love and sometimes love to hate about Italy, mostly love. Like hand gestures, of course. How could we communicate without them? People often ask me, if you love Italy so much, why don't you just move there? I can answer that question in 3 words: fare la coda, which is the Italians' inability to form a line, like their preferred method of boarding a train, illustrated here. I did a small guidebook to artisan shops and restaurants in Florence, which required me to taste test gelato around the city. And then I did this book. If you really want to drive yourself completely and utterly mad, I highly recommend doing a monograph of your work, where you can relive your entire life and career like a bad movie trailer. While I was working on this, however, I made a vow that once the book was finished, I would take a month off, something I had done only once in my career, and that was 30 years before. Let me tell you something. Every 30 years, it's a good idea to take a month off. But I hope you don't think I'm talking about a vacation, because I'm not. This was to do another book, of course. For decades, I had been obsessively documenting signs all over Italy while I watched, heartbroken, as they continued to disappear year after year after year. I had started shooting these signs as 35mm slides, then point-and-shoot snapshots, and finally digital, although they were never really meant for anything more than my own reference and enjoyment. This, by the way, is my favorite gelateria in Rome, by the way, and no one can cut a line like I can at that place. But as digital technology got better and better, I was finally able to consider putting these into a book. Ironically, it was that same technology that was making the signs disappear, to be replaced with clumsily crafted plastic signs made from free fonts. I felt a sense of urgency to go back and rephotograph these signs before they were all gone, like this one for a beloved art supply store, which is long gone. So I went to the American Academy in Rome, known to some as Mount Olympus, armed with a modest Google map and my secret weapon. No, this is not a selfie stick. This is a telescoping pole, which gave me what I'd always wanted in life, an extra 3 feet of height. And I was on my way. This was a stadium built by Mussolini for the Olympics in the late 1920s and is still in use with the Duce's name everywhere in really big letters. Futurist and fascist typography shows up all over Rome, from the zoo to a commuter train station. This is the only station in Rome with typography like this, which is sort of odd, which later inspired me to design a typeface. And this is the inside of that train station, where I was prepared for the first time ever in Italy to bribe a government official. Anything to get the shot, but I did, so that was good. And this is Garbatella, a housing complex with a sign like this on every building. Do you see that there's something missing on the left side to the left of the P? After the war, all the fascist symbols were removed with great patriotic zeal. I tried, whenever possible, to speak to the shop owners, like at this clothing store that I found on Google Street View. And the owner gave me this photo of what the shop looked like when his grandfather opened for business in 1939. And when I asked him about the style of the typography, he sheepishly said, "Abbiamo rubato l'M e l'N da Mussolini." We stole the M and the N from Mussolini. So they did. This, in my opinion, is the sexiest script in Rome, and it's a corner sign, so you get to see it twice. Again, it was a third-generation octogenarian owner who I spoke to. I was really curious to find out when this sign was created. He told me that the vertical sign was made in 1948, but the script had to wait because the tenants on the second floor were not very happy about it. They didn't want a sign, no matter how beautiful, blocking their view. So I asked him, "So what did you do about it?" And he shrugged as only a Roman could do, and he said, "So I bought the apartment." Over the course of that year, I took 3 more trips to Italy so I could return to different cities to reshoot as much as I could. Each location was unique. Florence, for example, has butcher shop signs like this, which I've never found in any other city. And I love how they worked the building number into the design. I thought that was pretty ingenious. I didn't find every sign like this one, which is why we have Photoshop. And this is the iconic Florence train station that many of you probably already know, built in 1930 with beautiful modernist signage that is still intact throughout the station. Then off to Bologna. These 3 signs appear together in the book since they will always live together in my heart. Whenever I go to Bologna, I always stay at this hotel. It's the green clock sign that you see in the middle of the photo, the Hotel Orologio, so that I'm perfectly situated to see all 3 of these signs at once, although one of them is now gone. You can see that I took this photo of the Cappelleria on the left when it was still indeed a hat store. Now they sell shoes, but at least they kept the sign. How many of you have ever been to Venice and never gotten lost? Nah. That's why they have these mosaic signs on the pavement with arrows pointing to hotels and restaurants that no longer exist. As soon as I returned to Venice, I started shooting these mosaic signs using a truncated version of my telescoping pole, and I couldn't help but notice the strange reaction that I was getting from the locals. Everyone put up their hands in mock horror until I finally realized that it looked to them like I was holding a rifle. And by the way, the sign was so filthy that I had to go back the next day with a box of baby wipes. And wasn't I happy when I found this mosaic, which I hadn't seen before, and it fit the double-page proportion of the book perfectly. That's what we all wait for. The street signs in Venice are done in an interpretation of Didot, thanks to a brief Napoleonic occupation in the early 19th century. And they're stenciled onto whitewashed rectangles called nizioletti, which is Venetian dialect for little sheets. And nearby on the island of Burano, they have a more rustic interpretation of the Nizioletti letter form, and a baffling numeral system that I finally managed to decode. What looks here like the letter J is actually a numeral 1. It's a good thing to know before you set out for Burano. Lucca has one of my favorite signs, and as you can see, this is no longer anything close to a pasticceria, but no matter. The Lucchese are very good about keeping their signs just for the sake of beauty. And this Forno in Lucca, however, is still a bakery. And then on to nearby Viareggio, that's the seaside town that I showed earlier when I first started this slideshow, which has equally majestic signs on these gelato-colored buildings. Could you advance that? Oh, got it, okay. As you go along the beach. And Sicily has a particular affection for wrought iron scripts, as well as typographic beaded curtains, which I've never seen anywhere else in Italy. And then finally going all the way back up north to Torino, where you can always find elegant signage in gold and brass. And this billboard-sized sign, yeah, it's actually even bigger than that, which, for a movie theater which is still in operation. The first time I saw this sign, I gasped. And by the way, the theater was originally named Dux, D-U-X, after the Duce, and it was changed to Lux after the war. So when this book came out, to my great surprise, it got a lot of really good press in Italy. All the reviews said basically the same thing. We pass by these signs every day and never noticed before, and it took an American to come here to make us appreciate them. So even before I finished this book, I felt the same sense of urgency to plan a trip for the next sign hunt. Certainly Paris, with its refined sensibilities, would show no tolerance for the removal of its beloved signs. Think again. This is from the before and after section of the book, which shows why it was so important for me to document these signs. This Tabac sign in the Marais, which I thought would stay there forever, had turned into the lackluster Le Renard, which you see below. And the once beautiful Deco facade of Atlas became yet another victim of default type, like so many others. And then there was the world's greatest script M for La Montana, and the new sign is not even worth discussing. So I went back with my poll, my Google Doc, and my handmade maps of each arrondissement with all the routes planned out. There was no time to lose in this race to preserve a type legacy. Before I would leave for each trip to Paris, I would spend hours at my desk in New York on Google Street View, locating signs I had photographed earlier by referencing negatives from my point-and-shoot photos. Yes, that's why it's good to save everything. Street View helped me find new locations by taking me virtually up and down every street. This saved me hours, if not months, of pounding the Parisian pavement. I was determined to photograph every boulangerie and pâtisserie sign and document the signs for the great La Samaritaine department store before it was turned into condos. Fortunately, I found the Folies Bergère in better shape than the first time I had photographed it, when California Dream Men was the main attraction. Big difference. I think my favorite thing about doing these books is taking a wrong turn, which is how I found this Deco sign for a butter and eggs shop. And although a lot of the neon is rapidly disappearing, I tried to find every example I could. And once I was back in New York, I spent even more time trying to locate the cameo appearance for this sign for Le Select in the film Breathless, which was extremely brief, but very memorable. But here's my big question. Is there a law in Paris that says that all hairdressers have to have a sign in a funky script? You'd think so. I decided it would be best to focus on mosaics, since those are more difficult to remove. This entryway to the Printemps department store unfortunately had a lot of foot traffic and a guard who takes his job far too seriously. But every time he turned away, I would kick the black floor mats further out of the frame so I could get on with my work. Only in Paris could a public toilet be considered a historic monument. This is an Art Nouveau restroom that had closed in the early 1980s, so I had to photograph the signs through a padlocked gate. But the mosaic artist apparently planned accordingly, leaving his credit front and center. There were many other noteworthy mosaic artisans working in Paris. The designs of the Palais Royal, like this one, were done by Edmond Coignet. And through a bit of detective work, I found this catalog with the address of his workshop. And I remembered that I had just photographed a mosaic facade on that very street. How could I forget? It was the French Society of Mineral Waters, a fantasy waterscape with cascading bubbles and inset crowns, undoubtedly the handiwork of Monsieur Coignet, the artisan next door. And what is Paris without the metro signs by the brilliant Hector Guimard? The typography of the metro stations has continued to evolve over time and never disappoints. Even with the occasional one-offs, like this one at the Rue de Sèvres station, I still can't tell if those are supposed to be monograms down below or if they're just decorative, but either way, they're quite beautiful. The last chapter of the book is called Sans mots, or without words, something the Parisians excel at. And wordless signs are nothing new in Paris. They can go back as far as the 16th century, when shopkeepers needed to reach an audience that was often illiterate. Optiques are on every block, identified only by these signs. Never any type. Although I have to say I really love that one in the upper right-hand corner that looks like they were drawn with a Sharpie. And the anthropomorphic signs, au pied du cochon, the pig's foot, and au chien qui fume, the smoking dog, are a natural fit for this genre. The smoking dog was the inspiration for a logo I did recently for a new restaurant in New York. Poulet sans tête, which is being made into a neon sign as we speak. Barcelona, Modernista and Deco Paradise was my next stop, where I did this book, which was published just 2 weeks ago. Here, it wasn't just about the type, but in many cases, it was the entire facade that needed to be documented, like this mosaic and stained glass tour de force. And I had to work very, very quickly this time. The historic fabric store El Indio, which had opened in 1870, had closed just before I got there. And this sign for a chocolate shop was removed a week before I photographed it. I'm sorry, a week after I photographed it. That would have been hard. This sign for a photo studio was one that I couldn't wait to see in person. I'd been checking regularly on Google Street View to make sure that it was still there. And as soon as I arrived in Barcelona, I literally ran to the storefront where I found this. That's what I said. I felt like I had missed the removal by a matter of minutes, and I probably did. I was devastated. This had happened with a number of other signs in Barcelona, but this one was really tragic. But the next day, I was interviewed by a reporter from the Spanish newspaper El País, and I couldn't help but mention my tale of woe to the reporter. This was in turn noted in the article that appeared a day later in the paper. And a week later, when I returned to New York, I received an email from Angel Lopez, grandson of the original owner, who said, "My family and I were very moved by the article, and if you're ever back in Barcelona, we will remount the sign so that you can take a picture." How long can an offer like that last? I went back immediately, and the whole Lopez family came out for the event. Even Angel's sister, yes, thank you. Even Angel's sister, Rosa, on the right, came from Germany with her husband and 3 children, and I dedicated the book to them. And while I was there the second time, I found other deco signs to fill out the book, including this curious one from an indoor market, which roughly translates as "oxen remains." You have to wonder what they were thinking when they put those little flowers inside the type. Barcelona has enough monograms above the doorways for a book in itself, which is something I continue to obsess about. And this was a monogram for the San Moritz Brewery. Those are hops, by the way, not artichokes, as I had originally hoped. And even some of the construction dates were treated like monograms, like here, where you see the numbers threading through one another. And every building with a monogram had to have the year crafted in wrought iron, which was always done beautifully. Many of them were made at this historic workshop, which has a pretty memorable sign of its own. So, did I say anything about profitability? Why, no, because as you may have guessed, these books are labors of love. So are these pencils that I've been doing, inspired by Italian double-sided pencils from the 1930s. Originally, these were always done in red and blue for teachers to correct homework, depending on the severity of the error. But as a rule, I prefer red and black. Following that, I did colored pencils called Tutti Frutti, and fortunately, they happened to be introduced at the very same time that the adult coloring book craze hit the US. So everybody who buys a coloring book needs to buy colored pencils, right? And this was the next one, Brillante, which are metallic colored pencils. So what's another way not to make money? Typeface design. Starting with this one, which was initiated by the Hamilton Woodtype Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. Has anybody ever been there? Yes. If you haven't, you must go, and you have to stay at the Frank Lloyd Wright House while you're there. Bill Moran, who is here in Minneapolis, and is very involved at Hamilton, invited me to create a font to be cut out of wood, which I decided to design in an Italian futurist style. The font was named after Hamilton's longtime pantograph operator, Bardell Dubec, who came out of retirement to cut this typeface, which I was able to witness firsthand. How often do you get to design a wood font? I was definitely influenced by the futurist signage that I had photographed in Italy, particularly that train station in Rome, was worth making that bribe offer, as well as Garbatella. This is a series of posters, antipasti, pasta, and dolci, all printed in letterpress at Hamilton, along with the specimen sheet. And last year, when I had a retrospective exhibition at the School of Visual Arts in New York, this font came to the rescue when we had to cover up an eyesore of a staircase. All I had to do was come up with 12 pasta names of equal lengths. The next font was Montecatini, named after a spa in Tuscany where Fellini shot a scene for his film 8½. And this was inspired by hand-lettered Italian posters from the Stile Liberty or Art Nouveau period. The font has over 200 ligatures to play with, which are irresistible, at least to me. Here are a few favorites. And finally, Marseille, the most recent, is a French accented Deco font based on the letter form that I designed for the cover of The Lover so long ago. And so I think it's just about brought us full circle. Thank you.
So you have this trip to Italy as a kid, and you fall in love with typography. What turned you from a person who collected and fell in love with typography to a person who actually made your own sort of forms?
Oh, well, that started pretty early too, I think. That's the same summer that I took my first trip to Italy. I sent away for a pen that I used to see advertised in the back of the New Yorker magazine. And I taught myself calligraphy. And soon I was making illuminated manuscripts of Bob Dylan lyrics that I would sell to my friends. So not only did I learn a skill, but it was a marketable skill.
Yeah, apparently so.
So there was hope. But I still didn't really know what graphic design was because they weren't calling it that then. They were calling it by the very unsexy term commercial art.
Right.
And
I think that's going to come back, though.
You think?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could. Everything comes back.
Do you have any of those still?
I don't.
Oh.
Maybe they'll show up on eBay one day. Who knows?
Maybe so. Anything from the early days like that sort of remain in somewhere in some attic somewhere?
No, because about 2 years ago, Steve, my husband, and I moved out of our apartment of 33 years, which was a real hoard fest, and we got rid of a lot. I was especially ruthless, and I threw everything out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
I decided because I never wanted anybody else to go through this stuff. I figured this was the last time I was going through it. And
because we would, you know. So I love the idea of you traveling around with these maps, photographing these signs. And it seems as if each town had their own kind of vernacular.
Yes.
And can you could I quiz you and you could like wine tasting where you know what region the thing is from?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, in fact, whenever I'm sorting out old 35 millimeter slides of signs and I'm trying to figure out where they were, I can usually tell just by looking at the building, what the building number looks like, if there's a trace of that, or the street sign, or the color of the building, you get a pretty good sense of what town it's going to be.
Yeah. And you also collect, objects. So when did you go from objects to signs? Was all part of the same sort of continuum?
Well, they've all been an obsession for me, but I'd say that around the 80s, a certain period of the 80s when the dollar was not doing so well in Europe and the flea markets were sort of not as great as they used to be, I decided to start focusing on signs because they were everywhere and they were free.
Right.
So, and they were so unusual because the sign makers weren't dealing with fonts. They were letterers. They were creating their own fonts or their own typography, and every town had its own particular style, which I thought was really interesting.
And so, when you went to Italy, did this just sort of like genetically come from within that you just loved? You fell in love with it, or
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
No, whenever I go to Italy, I always feel like I'm coming home.
Right. And so, what was your upbringing like? That was it always there? Was it sort of like something in the background, or was it really in the foreground? Growing up in an Italian American household.
Well, growing up in an Italian American household, the religion was food.
Yeah.
So
that's a good religion.
Yeah. No, it's a very good religion. I wouldn't want it any other way. And when I was growing up, I thought that every kid I knew had parents who would wake up in the morning and start arguing passionately about what to make for dinner. And actually, that's the first thing I think of when I wake up in the morning now,
so it was just part of everything.
Yeah.
And this also led to your work and doing food and food packaging and restaurants and stuff.
Right, which I never really thought I could do as a studio. I started my studio 28 years ago and thought, yeah, why not focus on restaurants and food packaging? But I had no idea how that was going to work.
Well, it worked out pretty well, and now it's like a huge part of everything. Now, you wouldn't think today this would be a problem to focus on food or restaurants.
Right.
I mean, it's what accounts for that change? Are more people just have better taste and style now?
Yeah, I think people are just much more aware. When I first started doing restaurants, it was just when people were starting to spend more money on restaurant design. And they were beginning to realize that the graphics needed some help too.
Yeah.
But I remember like some of the first conversations I would have with restaurant clients. One of the first things I had to do was try to make them understand why they had to pay both me and the printer. So,
Oh my God.
after all, don't you do the same thing?
Oh, well, thank you for leading the charge on that. Thank you so much for presenting. It was lovely.
Thank you.